Hello and welcome. Today I want to talk to you about something that I believe to be incredibly important to us as individuals and to us as a species. And that thing that I want to talk to you about is friendship. Friendship is a topic that is both philosophically rich and, more importantly, it's deeply relevant to our lives. We all have friends, we all need friends, we can't really function without them. So, our exploration of the concept of friendship today is going to be based around Aristotle and more specifically his theory of friendship that he presented in his Nicomachean Ethics. And we are also going to compare his insights with those of some other major philosophers, from Plato to Nietzsche. So, hopefully, by the end of this video, you will have you will gain a historical perspective on friendship or the concept of friendship, but also my hope is that you will acquire amongst this communication a toolkit for analyzing the relationships in your own life. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So we're going to start with Aristotle's classification of friendship. So, according to Aristotle, philia, which is a term that encompasses friendship, affection, and social bonds, a term that I probably mispronounced, by the way. My ancient Greek is, let's just say, subpar. Anyway, this concept it's an essential component of human life. And he identified three different types of friendship: friendships of utility, friendships of pleasure, or friendships of virtue, or of the good. So, a friendship of utility is something that arises when two individuals, they benefit from each other in some way. Business partnerships, professional relationships, acquaintances that serve a purpose, and so on and so forth. And these relationships, they're important to us in that in terms of their utility. The relationship is, in essence, a byproduct of the utility, rather than the utility being a byproduct of the relationship. So these friendships are, by their very nature, they are transient, they are impermanent. Once the shared benefit disappears, the relationship also evaporates. A friendship of pleasure is not all that dissimilar to a friendship of utility. So these are friendships that are built upon shared enjoyment. So you have buddies that you do hobbies with. You have friends in your sports team. You have, you know, maybe you play in a band or whatever, right? So you have these sort of groups of friends that you're friends with because you have that shared pleasure, that shared joy. And this type of friendship is really common in children and young people. Less common for those of us that are basically dinosaurs now. These friendships are also quite transient and impermanent in nature, because they tend to they tend to break down once the individual's personal interests shift, basically. So that's a friendship of pleasure. And finally, Aristotle speaks of the friendship of the highest form, so friendship of virtue, or friendship of the good. And this, according to Aristotle, is the rarest and most valuable form of friendship, because it's based upon a mutual appreciation of each other's character and virtue. So you come together because you share values and morals and so on, right? And unlike the other two types, the utility and pleasure friendships, which are themselves conditional and impermanent, virtue-based friendships are rooted in moral goodness, and they last as long as both friends remain virtuous. So at this point, I think it would be a good exercise to And it's just a thought exercise. You don't need to write anything down, but I just want you to have a think about some of the friendships in your life. Using this system, friendship of utility, friendship of pleasure, and friendship of virtue. How would you categorize each of those friendships in your life? So have a think about that. However, it's deeply personal, so don't put that in the comments or anything like that. Just have a think about it. It's purely a thought exercise. So now that we have examined Aristotle's framework, his sort of categorization of the types of friendship, we can start to think about some of the other philosophers and what they had to say. And we might as well start at the very beginning. We'll start with Aristotle's teacher, Plato. So Aristotle was a student of Plato for around 20 years. And they both value the importance of friendships. But Plato's view is actually much more abstract than Aristotle's. So it's worth thinking about that difference. So Plato questions whether friendship is based on similarity or difference, and whether the people desire friends for their own sake or for what they provide. Unlike Aristotle, who confidently sort of classifies friendship, Plato remains much more skeptical, emphasizing the philosophical complexity of human relationships. So it's worth noting that Plato was Aristotle's teacher. So although we are comparing their ideas, we are in some sense doing it the wrong way, because Aristotle was sort of built on Plato's ideas, not the other way around. But nonetheless, these views, they became the sort of this view put forward by Plato and then expanded on into the framework that we've just talked about by Aristotle, has become the it's the most sort of influential in Western philosophy, in terms of like a view of friendship. So it is really, really important. So after the fall of the Hellenistic age, as it were, we had the Romans, and the Roman philosopher Cicero builds upon Aristotle's views, because he was, like all Romans were, and all of us people here in the West are still, he was heavily influenced by Aristotle. So he builds upon that view, but he refines it, and makes it, just so for him. So while Aristotle acknowledges that friendships of pleasure and utility exist, Cicero argues that true friendship must be entirely based on virtue and moral goodness. So for him, only good people can have real friendships. Any relationship that's based on self-interest is, at best, a shadow of genuine friendship. I want to say about Cicero, just quickly, and it's really not related, but I was told recently that I'm pronouncing his name wrong, but I don't really know. So I'm told it could be Cicero or it could be Cicero. However, you'd have to speak to a linguist about that. I'm not a linguist. So I will stick with Cicero because that's what I've always said. So somebody jump in the comments and yell at me and let me know which one's the correct one. That would be really helpful. Getting back to what we were talking about, we can move on. Let's think about Epicurus, another really incredibly famous sort of Greco-Roman philosopher. So Epicurus takes a more sort of contrasting approach, because he approaches it more pragmatically. Friendship for him, for Epicurus, is valuable primarily because it provides security and peace of mind. The appropriate term is ataraxia. And he he sees or saw social bonds as a means to avoid pain and find comfort, suggesting that friendships might not need to be sort of rare or exceptional, but should actually be cultivated widely to enhance overall happiness. Unlike Aristotle, who sees virtue as the foundation of true friendship, Epicurus focuses on the pleasure that friendships provide. Now, I will say that the view of Epicurus on pleasure and so on and so forth, it's quite nuanced. And I did actually do a video before about Epicurus that explains a lot of that in some detail. So it's not quite the hedonistic philosophy that it sounds like it is. There is some nuance and depth to that that's definitely worth exploring, but this video is not the one. Go and look at that. It's in the feed somewhere. So now that we have thought about Epicurus, I think the next sort of logical school of thought to drop in on, so to speak, would be the Stoics. So the Stoics, they're quite detached, right? So the Stoics included people like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. And they share some common ground with Aristotle because they were obviously influenced by Aristotle, but they, as I say, they take a much more sort of detached approach. So they argue that the wise person is self-sufficient and does not need friendship to be happy. However, friendships between virtuous individuals are valuable because they allow for mutual moral improvement. Unlike Aristotle, who sees friendship as like a fundamental part of a good life, the Stoics view it as a secondary benefit rather than a necessity. So essentially, the Stoics do, for the most part, agree with Aristotle, but in many respects. But the importance of those relationships is really what's in question with the Stoics. So they view it as I say, as like a secondary benefit rather than a necessity. So now we can go forward in time, way forward in time, in fact, and we can go and visit Immanuel Kant. So Kant views friendship as a how do you put it, like a moral duty. But he believed that true selfless friendship is basically impossible because all human relationships contain some degree of self-interest, which makes the Aristotelian ideal of purely virtue-based friendships something that's in any sort of real sense difficult to achieve. You had who else? Arthur Schopenhauer. So Schopenhauer, he was really quite skeptical about the existence of friendships full stop, and essentially viewed them as a transactional affair. You get what you can out of it, essentially, and that's what everyone's in it for. Everyone's in it. Each party in that relationship is in it to get what they need out of it, and that's really all there is to it. It's quite a pessimistic view. This is generally the case with Schopenhauer, is quite the pessimist at times. So, the final philosopher that we're going to have a really brief look at and think about relating to this question of friendship is Nietzsche. So Nietzsche's perspective is really quite radically different from Aristotle. So Nietzsche sees friendship not as a source of like comfort, but instead it's a means of self-overcoming. So essentially he argued that a true friendship is where each party pushes each other towards great strength and independence. A true friendship involves challenge and struggle and competition. So Aristotle valued harmony in friendships. This is where the radical difference between him and Nietzsche lies. So Aristotle valued harmony in those friendships, whereas Nietzsche saw the value in those friendships existing in the struggle and competition and so on, and that those were the things that were going to drive a deep and meaningful relationship. So those are some of the other perspectives on friendship, and it has been a really quite I guess you could say a whistle-stop tour. This is a very short video today, which I'm sure is probably a good thing considering they're normally like an hour long. But this concept of friendship is never not going to be important, and it's always going to matter. We are social animals. We can't live without those social relationships. So Aristotle's theory, as a result, remains as relevant today as it did on the day that he came up with it. But how should we, actually apply that to our lives? Well, I think to do that, we have to consider the relationships in our lives. So, do you have friendships of utility, pleasure, or virtue? And if you look at the collection of friendships that you have, you'll probably find that it's a real mixed bag. But the largest number of relationships in that mixed bag are going to be utility and pleasure. Because, as Aristotle points out, the relationships of virtue, the friendships of virtue, are slower to build and harder to come by. So it is likely that you're going to have way more utility and pleasure friendships than you are sort of virtue-based friendships. But you will likely have a mixed bag. And another point to consider when examining the relationships in your life is have your friendships evolved over time, as Aristotle suggests that they might. So if you remember the relationships of utility, they the big change in them is when the utility is no longer present, the relationship falls apart. And the same with the pleasure. Whereas the virtue relationship, it's kind of it's not that the relationship falls apart, it's that both parties sort of grow and change over time as a result of their shared interactions over time. Another point of consideration when examining the relationships in our own lives is how, and this is especially relevant, I think, so how do modern social relationships, which are shaped by technology and globalization, how do they fit into Aristotle's framework? And this is a really important point to consider because actually in the era of social media, many of the relationships that we have through those platforms could be seen as friendships of utility or pleasure, with fewer deep sort of virtue-based friendships. So can Aristotle's framework help us to rethink the way that we engage with other people? And that's a really important point to consider. But I don't want to keep you all day. I think we've covered the important parts, so I'm going to attempt to wrap up now. So, basically, what we've talked about in this video is how Aristotle has provided us with a really quite compelling framework for understanding friendships, a framework that has influenced philosophical thought for the last couple of thousand years. And as we've seen, his views aren't the only ones that exist. Other thinkers like Epicurus and Nietzsche and Plato and so on and so forth challenge and refine those ideas. So I now have a couple of questions that I would like you to answer in the comments. 3 questions, in fact. So the first question is, do you agree with Aristotle that friendship is essential for a flourishing life? Why or why not? So that question again is, do you agree with Aristotle that friendship is essential for a flourishing life? Why or why not? And the second question is, do you think it's possible to have true friendships without shared virtue, as Epicurus suggested? So that question again is it possible to have true friendships without shared virtue, as Epicurus suggested? And our final question is, how do modern relationships align with or challenge Aristotle's framework? So that question again is, how do modern relationships align with or challenge Aristotle's framework? So those are some questions that I want to leave you with, and I'd very much appreciate if you could jump in the comments to answer those questions. That would be fantastic. But as we part ways, I think the most important thing to take from all of this is is essentially the toolkit that Aristotle has provided us, a means by which we can assess the friendships we have, the relationships we have in our lives, and then we can then better understand the value and the implications of those relationships. So something worth considering, I think, for all people, really. So but yeah, so friendship is a really, really important subject. It will always be important because we are social animals. And I think by the fact that we can go back to Aristotle and see that the ideas that we have now are not all that similar to the ideas we had then, well, it shows us that the importance of this question to us as individuals and as a collective, as a species. And I doubt we will ever stop asking these questions, because even if we had the answers, so to speak, for us as individuals, we still need to regularly reassess those relationships and so on, right? So it's super important, so it's worth thinking about and exploring. So thank you very much for your time today. I very much appreciate it. I hope you have enjoyed it and found it interesting. And as you have got to the end, I would very much appreciate it if you could do all the YouTube things, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and all that good stuff. It, first and foremost, obviously really helps me out. It'd be fantastic. But more importantly, it tells YouTube that you are interested in hearing more about these topics, and it will start showing you other people, other creators, other thinkers exploring these topics as well. So you'll gain a much wider perspective and won't be pinned down by any one specific sort of viewpoint or whatever. So interpretation, that's what I was looking for. You won't be pinned down by any one specific interpretation. So yeah, thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Goodbye.